They can be. I mean, the polls can be a positive thing. When George Gallup introduced commercial polling, he called it the pulse of democracy. Here, finally, was the ability of the political class not simply to listen, but to hear. And not simply to hear those who had a voice, but to listen to all Canadians, all Americans. The problem, I think, has become is that we have overinterpreted polls and that we interpret them too literally. It's a little bit like reading the Bible. I mean, there's great stories there are great lessons to be taught, but that if we mistake, myths for facts, we can find ourselves, fundamentally believing things that in fact aren't true. One of the real difficulties, I believe, is that there's such a proliferation of polling right now. It's kind of turned us into unthinking know-it-alls. So, for example, if we find out that Canadians do not want to pay user fees for healthcare, and everyone knows that, and I'm a politician and I advocate user fees for healthcare, I'm immediately turned an idiot, because I've obviously done something that's politically stupid, because we all know Canadians don't want user fees. What ends up happening is that you declare an intellectual jihad around the issue of user fees in healthcare. No one's allowed to discuss them. No one's allowed to debate them. And debate and discord is the cornerstone of democracy. So the extent to which polling can stifle that discord, it can be used in a negative way. Well, the other thing that's interesting is that people always ask, do the polls affect voters? And the answer, by and large, is not directly, but it certainly does indirectly. Because what the polls also do is that they reflect, what polls also do is that they affect the way the media covers the campaign. So if I come out with a poll tomorrow that said Michael Ignatieff has just surged 5 points in the polls, everyone will be covering Michael Ignatieff with a very positive kind of screen. They will be saying, Ignatieff's got momentum, look at the big crowds, whereas if I said he was gone down, they probably wouldn't even bother covering. If there were crowds there, they wouldn't bother to cover it at all. And that will have an effect. That will have kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy effect. We're in an interesting situation right now. We're post-debate. I mean, a lot of people believe that Jack Layton and the NDP have momentum. And so you have people like me who comment on these things, talking that possibly the most interesting race will be for second place, or even the possibility of the Liberals becoming marginalized, as you see, as it may happen, towards the end of the campaign, a Stop Harper movement coming from the center-left that would gravitate to whoever is most likely to stop him. If the polls say that Ignatieff is going down, that might exaggerate the level of support that Layton and the NDP has. No, I don't think it perpetuates any single myth. I think it could perpetuate a lot of myths. In fact, if the New Democrats were coming up in the polls, as many believe they are right now, quite the opposite. I mean, it will probably exaggerate the kind of support the NDP have, because more people will be covering them. They're covering what Jack Layton is doing now in Quebec in a way that they never would have, absent polls that said that he's actually got some tailwinds behind him there right now. I think we just have to use polls as they were meant to be used. The pollster is not all-knowing. The pollster is not a clairvoyant. We can't predict things in the future that are going to happen based on polls. That's not what polls are ever designed for. They're designed for a snapshot in the moment to reflect only the question that was asked. And so when we ask, if election was held tomorrow, how would you vote? And the Conservatives go down 2 points, and we say, oh, it's the Oda effect. That's just bull, quite frankly, because if we haven't tested the Oda effect and been able to factor it in very precisely and correlate it with that 2% decline, we're just speculating. And if we're doing that, what we're doing is that we're taking a population that otherwise, if they didn't have polls, would be uninformed and making them misinformed, and that's irresponsible.
Polls become even more distorted.
Yeah, as voter turnout goes down, the polls are tougher and tougher to analyze. So, for example, I mean, the most unreliable polling always is municipal polling, because turnout rates are around 30%. So if I'm doing a random probability sample, 70% of the opinion I'm gathering is really immaterial, because these are non-voters. And being able to ferret out a voter from a non-voter, as I mentioned earlier, is a very, very difficult task. So yes, turnout has an additionally influencing effect on the accuracy, the end of the day accuracy. Historically, what we've done is when we have undecideds, usually people who are undecided to the question if the election happened tomorrow, how would you vote, are undecided about everything. They'd be undecided about whether today is Friday or not. So what we've done quite successfully and historically is we factored them out and proportioned them proportional to the decided vote, because they're non-voters. When you get a much, and undecided rates usually around 10-12%, but when your non-voting population becomes 40%, as it has been in the 2008 election, 42%, that we have a much bigger problem on our hands. Well, if the average person is truly interested in polls, they should go and read Survey Methodology 101 textbook, or even go to Wikipedia and say, polling, sampling, margins of error, in order to understand a little bit of this and have a capacity to read the polls a little bit more critically. The first people who should follow that advice are journalists, many of whom have no idea whatsoever. For example, the fact that you have a lot of the pollsters reporting numbers down to the first decimal point is crazy. It is the discipline by definition is not precise enough to do that. So you've got one of two things going on. Either people are stupid and don't understand the limits of polling, or they're deceitful. They're trying to make out that they have a precision that clearly they do not have. Well, it's complicated because most of the polling now is done by telephone, and for a sample to be projectable back to the population from which it's drawn, everyone has to have an equal chance to be selected. That's called random probability. That's the only way that they're scientifically founded. Well, young people tend to disproportionately have cell phones, not landlines, and that our calling goes into landlines. So what you're seeing now is you're seeing a lot of the polling, the random digit dialing, telephone polling, skewing very old and missing out young people. Anecdotally, I have 3 adult children who don't have landlines. They are not part of my samples, therefore they do not have a chance to be selected, and it skews our polling. We have some difficulties in this regard. The additional compounding fact is that young people, especially first-time voters, have terribly low rates of participation and turnout. And so even when you get a young person's opinion, the opinion might not translate into a behavior. That is, they may intend to vote Liberal or Conservative or New Democrat, but if they don't vote, that opinion is skewing the total sample in a way that doesn't reflect what's actually going to happen on voting day. So it's an industry that's in transition right now. A lot of people are starting to try to use hybrid distribution systems of combining telephone and cell phone and internet even. So if you do an internet poll, the other thing is that it'll skew very young for exactly the same reason. So we have some difficulties in getting to young people right now and treating them properly. Again, it's very problematic because one of the limits of polling is that polling cannot predict behavior in the absence of events that would engender behavior. So, for example, one of the things we have a very, very difficult time doing is predicting rates of turnout. If it snows, the rate of turnout might be different than if it doesn't. So we use proxy measures. We would ask people, for example, going back to all federal, provincial, and municipal elections where you might have been eligible to vote, did you say that you voted in most of them, a few of them, or none of them? And let people volunteer all of them. Now, the difficulty with young people is that they don't have a history of track record. What if this is the first time? So I don't even have a proxy measure. So the most honest answer is we have no idea who's going to vote and who is not going to vote on on voting day, and that not knowing is even more problematic with young people than it is with people who have a history and track record of voting. Of all the age cohorts, the ones that will be least represented will be young people, no question. Now, let's say if a campaign asked me, I really want to get a handle on first-time voters, what I would do then is I would oversample. And I would use multiple distribution systems. I would use the internet. I would use cell phone lines. I would use hard lines. And I would have a significantly larger sample than random probability would allow me to have in, let's say, a national sample of 1,000. And I would probe in depth. I would probably augment it with what they call qualitative research, focus group research, to find out much more about the motivation of young people in voting and non-voting, and I would factor that in. That all said, we're in the realm of art much more than science when we get to this particular level.